So this video is going to focus on Eysenck's personality theory. Again, if I draw your attention to the spec on the screen, it's referenced here under personality, so down here. So where the spec is saying that you need to be able to refer to biological explanations, it's also listing personality theory as an example of a biological explanation. And as a result, we're going to learn about Eysenck. It's worth noting as well, though, that Eysenck's personality theory can also be used to answer a question on individual differences within crimes, because obviously personality differs across individuals. Eysenck's personality theory basically works on this idea that personality can be categorised into four main features, whether you're an extrovert and an introvert, or whether you're a stable or neurotic character. Now, Eysenck theorised that our personality has a biological basis because he's basically saying that what personality type we are is determined by our arousal levels within our areas, which I'll explain in a minute, across the brain. Now, he basically is suggesting this idea of introvert or extrovert, neurotic and stable. Now, extroverts tend to be sociable, craving excitement and change, and therefore they become bored quite easily. They're kind of carefree, optimistic, impulsive, spontaneous, whereas introverts are quite reserved. They might plan things through. They might be very good at controlling their emotions. Neurotics are also known as unstable just because they're on the other end of the scale of stable. They tend to be more anxious, moody, overly emotional, and can find it quite difficult to control themselves or calm themselves down once they've allowed themselves to become quite upset. Whereas stable might be emotionally very, very calm. They might be not particularly reactive to situations. Now, actually, later on, Eysenck actually proposed a third psychological trait called psychoticism, which is the idea of lacking in empathy, being very cruel, aggressive, particularly a loner. And this is a trait to do with compassion and morality. So, for example, people who've scored high on P scores will also tend to be high in antisocial traits like selfishness, hostility, impulsivity. And actually, there seems to be a strong link between people diagnosed with this psychotic scale and their hormone activity, particularly testosterone. Now, Eysenck's, I mentioned at the beginning, can be used to talk about individual brain differences because Eysenck is suggesting that this idea of personality differencing from person to person is because of differences within our brain regulation. Now, Eysenck is specifically talking about the ascending reticular activating system, which I'm going to call ARAS all the way through because it's a pain to say. But your ARAS is basically responsible for maintaining an optimum level of arousal within your brain. Now, in order to do this, it might excite your sensory information that's been received by the brain, or it might dampen it down in order to be able to get that optimum level. Now, within extroverts, the idea is that they have a strong nervous system themselves, and therefore they don't actually achieve that optimum arousal level because they might be chronically under-aroused. So because they're under-aroused by the natural sensory information that their brain is receiving, what they tend to do there is therefore look for behaviours that are designed to increase their arousal levels. So, for example, your extroverts might be risk takers because they're looking for that external stimuli in order to be able to arouse their ARAS and therefore allow them to get that optimum level of arousal. Introverts, therefore, are the opposite, so they tend to have a weaker nervous system, which means that they're over-aroused by the natural sensory information that their brain is receiving. And as a response to that, they tend to increase their sensory stimulations and therefore seek behaviour that will lower the arousal levels because they're almost being aroused over the top, if you see what I mean. So actually from their external stimuli, they're looking for that calming down. Neurotics seem to have an ARAS that's particularly reactive to these stimulations and therefore to the sensory information that's being received to the brain. And that might lead to them being overreactive in certain situations. So, for example, a neurotic might overreact or be particularly dramatic in a stressful situation because they're being more reactive to the sensory information that's being received. Now, again, talking about this idea of your ARAS being aroused, if I can just be really clear here, the job of the ARAS is to maintain this optimum level, like I said, this ideal level of alertness. We're building on this idea that we are the most effective when we're at that ideal level of alertness. And if the ARAS is underactive, it means that they're not receiving enough stimulation from the environment. And that's why I said a minute ago, those extroverts therefore will crave this stimulation from outside areas. So they therefore might go on roller coasters, they might be particularly spontaneous within their actions. Now again, this neuroticism is based on this aras, but also the autonomic nervous system, which enables us to respond to stress. Now, if this does its job effectively, a person will be particularly stable, they'll be able to regulate their own mood and learn easily. But if that automatic nervous system is inefficient, then that person will also tend to be more neurotic, because they will be more susceptible to things like mood changes or learning from previous experiences. So it's really important that we link this to crime. So again, I always talk to you about your essays being funnels, and it's absolutely okay to start an essay on this, defining kind of those 4 different strands of personality, and then go into that detail of linking those to aras. But what you must make sure you're doing all the way through is linking this to how it explains criminal behaviour. Now, Eysenck is basically saying that people who score highly on both the extrovert and the neurotic scores are much more likely to engage within criminal behaviour. Now, he suggests that someone with a high E score, because as we've just said, means that they're particularly stimulus hungry, they're looking for that external stimulation, and therefore they might be looking for these thrill enhancing behaviours, which might be seen as breaking the law. Now, people who have high neurotic scales also have high anxiety drive, which can lead to criminal behaviour. So this might mean that they react emotionally to stressful situations, like we just talked about, but this emotion might come out as aggression, for example. Equally, because they're less able to learn from the consequences of their behaviour, they might be less responsive to situations where they've got the police arriving, for example, or where they've got a particular behaviour that they know will have a certain consequence. They might not be as aware of that. Now, evidence to support this. So we've got Cochrane, who basically did a review of studies and found that prisoners did tend to have higher neurotic scores than control groups. But he also found that they didn't necessarily score higher on the extrovert scores. And actually, in some cases, they might have had lower extrovert scores. Obviously, if you're lower on the extrovert scale, then you're higher on the introvert scale. And that might have been higher than the control. So Cochrane there is suggesting that it isn't this idea of E and N, it's just this idea of M. Now, Farrington found that official offenders had higher N scores, but then lower N scores where self-reported offenders showed quite the opposite. And again, at the bottom, Eysenck found that there were higher levels of extroversion among inmates who had higher levels of recidivism, remembering that recidivism is this idea of reoffending. It's only very briefly been on the exam so far in terms of a short answer question, so explaining a strength of personality as a factor that can influence crime. So obviously you would pick up on the question here that this idea of personality in crime is making you think of Eysenck, but it is essentially asking you for a strength, so it's an AO3 question, and the explain means that it's an identify, justify type structure. So as you can see here, by saying Eysenck found that there were higher levels of extroversion among inmates who had higher levels of recidivism, that's your identify, that's what your strength is. But your justifying is therefore saying this is supporting Eysenck's theory because it shows that he has validity when he said that high levels of extroversion were associated with criminal behaviour. So you're identifying what your strength is, but then you're justifying why this is a strength. So you're saying this is a strength because it supports Eysenck's theory. Now, Eysenck also has a link with drugs here, which again we can use to link back to this idea of how personality theory can lead to criminal behaviour, because he's also saying that people who experiment with drugs are also those people that tend to have high psychotic personalities. And he justifies this by saying since that drug taking is risky and also seen as antisocial, these characteristics all link to that psychotic personality type. Now, some creative types also believe that drug taking unlocks their imagination, and again, this idea of creativity and imagination can also be linked to high P scores as well. Now, if you think about it, think about what we said about your aras, we know that drugs themselves can be particularly stimulating. So again, this might draw drugs to people who are strongly extrovert, because remember we said that these extroverts are craving stimulation for their aras. So this might be why people who take part in recreational drugs might also have higher extrovert scores to start with. Now, most extroverts get the stimulation that they need from sport and socialising. I'm not saying that everybody does drugs has got extrovert personalities, but it would suggest a link there in terms of craving stimulation. Now, don't forget, though, the other function of drugs may also be to regulate mood, and this is something that neurotics can find very difficult, as we said a minute ago. And therefore, this combination of high E and high N, particularly along with a high P, might be the perfect storm for people who take drugs. And therefore, this idea if you link about drug taking behaviour to criminal behaviour, that might create this perfect storm for why people are participating within drugs, which is obviously a criminal behaviour. So it's a nice example for you to put in of your essay as to how these two factors come together. I've put a possible 8 marker on the board for you if you want to pause and have a go. Evaluate a biological explanation of individual differences for 8 marks. It's a perfectly plausible question that could be asked. Remember I said at the very beginning, it's not going to reference Eysenck. Your key here with the question is this idea of individual differences, because we know that individual differences can lapse across personality. So essentially you would be describing and evaluating the impact of Eysenck on criminal behaviour.